Hello and welcome to the Value of Testing podcast. My name is Randy Rice and I hope you've been having a great summer so far. We're just coming off of the July 4th holiday here in the U.S. By the way, this is July 4th of 2026 in case you're watching this far in the future. So it's a big one here in the U.S., number 250. But I kind of took a little bit of a break for a week there, but here we go with another topic, which the topic for this podcast would be things that I tell new testers. Now, before you turn this off as an experienced tester, I really want to encourage you that some of the things I'm going to be talking about here are really good things to remember, even for those of us who have been in the field for a while. So I want to kind of go over these things, and hopefully by the end of this video, you will have a list of things that you can really consider in your own career. By the way, I'm working on a new book, and this is going to be one of the chapters in that book. It's going to be How to Become a Better Tester is the name of the book, or something like that. That's my working title for right now. So you're the first to know that that's going on. And I'm telling myself, this book, unlike my last book, I hope to get out in just a couple of 3 months as opposed to a couple of 3 years. It's funny, though, The Wit and Wisdom of Software Testing, the book I'm referring to, I started out thinking, okay, it's going to be like 20 of my Randyisms. And as it turned out, it was more like 35 of my Randyisms and about 20 some odd other quotes from other people that I really found helpful. And so just like a software project, the scope really increased, which is not a good thing with a book or anything for that matter. But anyway, so, here's the deal. I have worked with a lot of teams over the years, over 40 years now that I've been in the field of software testing. And if you go back to my development years, it's right at 50 years now. So I've seen a lot. And I remember when I made this transition into the field of software testing, it was a really unusual route for me to get there. I was a developer, and I got this book in the mail by Boris Beiser called Software Testing Techniques, and the reason I got it was because I forgot to send the card in. This was back in the days of the record clubs and the tape clubs and the book clubs, where they would send you the selection of the month automatically unless you sent the card back in that said that, no, I declined this month's selection. Well, I was busy, I forgot to send it in, and I wound up with this book, and I opened it up, opened up the package, and it was Software Testing Techniques. And my first thought was, why do I need a book on testing? I'm a developer. That kind of shows you where my mind was at. But up until that point, for several years of being a developer, no one ever told me or expected me to test my software. I had no access to a test environment, no access to any tools. In fact, there was only one small book on software testing, The Art of Software Testing by Glenn Myers, that was around in the late 70s. I believe that's considered probably the first book. I think there may be another one that people think predates that. But anyway, there was just not a lot of information about testing. So here comes Boris Beiser's book in about probably 1985, 86, thereabout. And so I started reading the book, and all of a sudden, as I started to apply these techniques, my code started getting better, and I really kind of fell in love with the idea of testing, even testing my own stuff. And so one thing led to another, and this company that I was working for eventually got bought by KPMG. And one of our clients actually, they really had a bad need for someone to manage their software quality efforts. And I was ready to get off the road, and so we kind of worked a deal. It doesn't happen very often with consulting companies, but they let the client hire me. And I was hired into this QA management position. And I just learned so many things. I mean, I never was an in the trenches tester before that. Now, after that, I was, strangely enough, after I got into consulting and that kind of thing. But up until that time, I was just thrown into the water to not only get good at testing, but to lead a team at doing that as well. So I learned a lot of things in that journey of about 2 years. It was kind of like, I refer to it as my baptism by fire in those days. So I want to go over some of those lessons with you, and hopefully these will resonate. I would love to hear your comments in the video. Also, if you found this video helpful and this content helpful, please subscribe and like, you know the deal there. So the very first thing is that as a tester, you're an inspector. Okay, you cannot guarantee quality. I'll often say it's kind of like being a fruit inspector, you know, and you don't blame the fruit inspector for bad fruit. You simply are saying, here's the reality of things, and you know that's kind of how people should at least take that information. Unfortunately, there are too many people out there who believe that testers are also guarantors of quality, and that's just not the case. Now, a lot of times testers also get sidetracked on this by thinking that they can control more things than they actually can control. For example, you may be working on a project, on a sprint, let's say, for example, and you find a lot of defects. In fact, you might find that really big showstopper defect just before release. You report it, you know it's a bad defect, and they decide to go live anyway. That can be a very demoralizing thing to testers. I know it's been for me. I get questions about this all the time as I train testers. You know, they'll say, I don't even know why we're here. We report defects, and then the people on the team just ignore them, or they will defer them for another release, build up technical debt, that kind of thing. But I always ask them, I'll say, well, look, did you get paid this week? And they'll say, yes. And I said, well, you know, you've done your job. Basically, you tested to the best of your ability, and you found defects, you reported them, so go home and relax. You cannot take that personally. Now, in fact, the only way, in my opinion at least, that a tester can fail is to fail to report a discovered defect or fail to perform a specified test. It's even not within your scope to be able to test everything, because that's impossible too. But you just can't control the decisions that other people make around the defects, or even their perception of you and what that should be as being a tester. So really, this was one of the big things that I learned really early on. In fact, I really got very stressed out when I first walked into the job of being a QA manager. And unfortunately, I let it just eat at me for too long. I was taking things way too personally, drifted into some depression. It was not a good thing, but I did learn from it, and I did recover from it. And so that was the big lessons learned, and that has been a very helpful thing as I work with test managers and even testers to understand really what are the expectations around what we do. And so, you know, once again, we cannot ensure quality. The best we can do is to give accurate information that's helpful for decision makers. And so that's a good thing to keep in mind. The second thing is that defects are valuable. And initially, when I started testing, I would see defects as this big alarming thing that I had found, and that they were totally negative in nature. But since learned that really the defects give us opportunities to learn and improve. And, you know, I always tell testers to be very observant and don't get sucked into the boredom of testing that occurs sometimes. Now, defect information is actually one of the most telling sources of project data that we have. And a lot of that, though, depends on how well we capture and convey accurate information about the defects that we're finding. But think about this. Each defect will cost the organization money. And if we don't learn from them, then we're wasting a lot of time and money. And so the leverage comes when we turn the mistakes that lead to defects into learning opportunities. So, the reality is that some lessons are only learned by hard experience. Now, personally, I like to learn from other people's hard experience, but the reality is that it just doesn't do any good to place blame over a defect. All that the blame does is lower the morale and shut down the communication. It's kind of like beating that proverbial dead horse, hoping it's going to come back to life. So there's a perspective to defects that they are good. And good in the sense that you're going to fix them before the customer finds them, hopefully, and also good that you can learn from them. The third thing is that everything's fine in testing until you report the first defect. And this is really where the reality of being a tester, actually starts to sink in. You can do all the stuff. You can plan the test, get all the needed resources in place, and it seems like everyone's on your side. But things start to get tense when you start to report your first problem. Now the shift in attitude happens because now you're kind of being critical of someone else's work. Even if it's not a negative criticism, you still have that idea that you're critiquing someone. And when people get critiqued, they might have their egos bruised, or this sense of pride of ownership, comes into play. And sometimes it can strain relationships. One thing that I always suggest to testers is that go back and reread some of your past defect reports as if you were the recipient of them. And you might find that you might need to be a little bit more diplomatic. See how gently I said that? It may not be as much fun to write a defect report without sarcasm, but it will help to maintain good relationships. So I would even say that on individual defect reports that you're now writing, before you file it, before you press that save button or send button or whatever, take a reread of your description and just make sure that it has a good objective tone to it, that you're conveying the right information, the right facts, and helpful information as well. Another thing, this is my fourth thing, is that you can only test what you can observe. Sometimes we, as testers, we get all caught up in creating somewhat complex tests, very creative tests, which is fine. But if you don't have a way to observe the results, then what does it matter? Some applications allow you to see a lot, but there are still things going on behind the scenes that you may not have much access to. These might include structural views like the code, perhaps hidden objects that may be on the interface, or maybe some kind of background processing that may be going on. So just keep in mind, if you can't really see the outcome from the test very well, then you probably don't want to have it in your test stack. The number 5 thing that I have is never forget how you got someplace. And what I mean by that is when you're testing, you want to have a trail that you can document. Here's how I got to the place where I found the defect. And one of the problems I see typically with beginning testers is they may get all caught up in performing a test. It may be a scripted test, or maybe an exploratory test or something. But even with a scripted test, sometimes they may have gotten off the trail a little bit. And they may have forgotten exactly how they manifested this defect or failure. So, you can do things like you can do screen recording, and that kind of thing that can help you have this trail that you can paint. And plus, it's always good to have that available so that you can show a developer exactly what you were doing, because the last thing you want is for the developer to come back and say, I can't reproduce this, and therefore nothing happens to it. And sure enough, sooner or later, a user is going to find it in the real world, more than likely. The sixth thing is that standards and processes are your friend. Now, I know this is an unpopular opinion, but we have a ton of standards out there, some for software testing, like ISO 29119, and processes that people have developed in organizations, and even processes that you can model and copy. And I know this idea of standards and processes might seem confining to you, but they do give you guidance in how you do your job. And I would encourage you, don't reject standards just because they may be detailed and lengthy. In fact, the whole concept of using standards is that you tailor those to meet your own needs. Instead, take the perspective of using them as a guide to do your job faster and more consistently. They really do help a lot. The seventh thing is that there's never enough time for testing. One of the biggest complaints I hear from testers is that there's too much work, too little time. Well, the reality is that there's never enough time to do anything, to test anything to any degree of completeness. And this is especially true when you factor in things like the non-functional attributes like usability, security, compatibility, interoperability, those kind of things. So instead of just continuing to complain about the lack of time, get better at prioritizing based on things like risk and criticality and those kind of things, and focus on the application objectives that are important to your senior management. And sometimes we actually may overtest because our objectives are misaligned with what the sponsors value. So just kind of keep that in mind, that it's not really so much about getting more time as it is to dealing with the time that you have a little bit better. Number 8 is you can't find all the defects. Now, we often see this when a defect is found in production. It's called an escape sometimes by people. And of course, the blame many times goes back to the tester. Why didn't you find this defect and that kind of thing? And the truth of the matter is you can't find all the defects because you can't test everything. We just mentioned the time issue, but even if you had all the time in the world, like I said, you still don't have time to test everything. So you may do a complete job of testing, test all your cases, even do other types of testing, have a high level of defect removal, but yet 100% defect removal is an elusive, if not impossible, goal. In fact, I'll go so far to say that I don't believe zero defects is even possible when it comes to software, because there are just too many things that are variables and can factor in, too many different perspectives on what would constitute a defect. Number 9, this is kind of taking a little bit different direction now. That is to maintain a sense of humor and perspective. One of the best things you can do is just to keep it light and to have a healthy sense between what you're doing and having a sense of humor. I'm not telling you to be a clown all the time, but just realize that this situation one day will pass, and that life will go on no matter what happens, and just try to maintain perspective and kind of lighten up on it. Number 10 is to strive for excellence instead of perfection. Now, at this point, I probably need to be like in a self-help meeting, hi, I'm Randy, I'm a perfectionist. I totally admit that sometimes I get caught up in perfectionism. The problem is that when we get caught up in that need for perfection, or that quest for perfection, whatever you want to call it, and with that 100% perfection as the standard, then we really kind of get caught up whenever we miss that. And you're going to miss it, okay? And nothing's going to be perfect. And I kind of remember some of those posters back in the day of the quality movement back in the 90s where some of the posters say 99.9% isn't good enough. You know, those can put you under some pressure too. But the problem with perfectionism is that it's going to slow you down. It's going to put fear in everything that you do and also make you more critical of others and just generally even drive your friends and family to the point of despair because you're always just dwelling on little bitty details. Now, of course, no one wants defects, but they happen regardless. Even if you're a perfectionist, you're still going to have to deal with defects. Now, to deny or to think otherwise is just to deny reality there. So instead, focus on excellence. Excellence is a habit that is reflected in your attitude and your dedication to your work. If you're committed to being the best, then you're going to go the extra mile. And my observation is that most people are fairly forgiving when they see a mistake or experience some kind of lapse in service. The thing they pay the most attention to is the response to those issues. The 11th thing is that developers are not the enemy. Okay, it really takes the entire project team to deliver a quality project or product even. And while it may seem at times that the developers don't care about quality, there may be more issues there than meets the eye. And you'll typically make way more progress by working with developers instead of against them. Believe me, I've tried both the adversarial and the collaborative approaches, and the adversarial approaches never work. They do nothing but just make things worse. And also remember that good communication is the foundation for everything else we do. It's a major key to successful projects and testing. In fact, it underpins everything we do in IT or any of the computing field altogether. But when you take that adversarial position, then the communication stops, and so does most of the information that you need for testing. Number 12 is to build and maintain a personal network. And it's those personal and professional relationships that are such a great asset. They're your support system, and they can help you when you may come into a place where you don't have a job, you're needing to find a job, or you're needing advice on what to do in your present situation. It's good to have a mentor. And then when you learn enough lessons yourself, then you can be a mentor to someone else also. The 13th thing is to keep building your skills. And it's your skills that distinguishes you from others. Always keep learning. You can do that by attending maybe some kind of professional meetings, obtaining certifications, or reading in the profession. I know personally I make it a goal to have at least one book going at all time related to my personal and professional growth, whether that be in testing or leadership, business, IT, whatever. There was one personal development guru, I think it was Brian Tracy, that I heard say this one time, that if you read for 30 minutes a day on any given topic, in 5 years you'll be an expert on it. And it worked for me. I mean, when I first got into testing, I just kept reading. And once again, we didn't have a lot of books back then on it. But the more I read, the more I was able to apply and build my skill set out. Number 14, when the going gets tough, the lazy get creative. I actually made a sign with that on there in that first job that I was telling you about when I was a test manager, because it reminded me that I needed to use creativity as a point of leverage in problem solving. You need to be able to learn to see problems in new and creative ways. Now, you may have a good test plan, but how are you going to deal with changes when they occur? And they are going to occur. As the old saying goes, no plan survives the first day of battle, right? So flexibility is a key attribute of good problem-solving leaders. And It's not that necessarily you're lazy, okay? But sometimes we can overwork the problem. And it's good just to take a step back, get a second angle on the problem, and apply creativity to help you solve those problems. And 15, simple is not always easy. A lot of what we do in testing seems simple. It's like, I'm going to run this set of test cases, or I'm going to follow this test script, I'm going to follow this checklist, or do this exploratory test, and I kind of work through the menus, those kind of things. But even though I do this, I should see this kind of thing, or now even with AI, I do this, and now what am I seeing? Is it right or not kind of thing? The challenge is in the consistency that it takes to maintain the effort. There are some solutions to problems that seem too simple at first, but don't discard an idea just because it's simple and obvious. I use the analogy here sometimes. It's kind of like flossing your teeth. Is flossing your teeth hard? No, it's not. It's actually simple to do that. However, it's the consistency. Most dental hygienists say, you ask them the one thing that people lie about, and it's flossing. It's kind of funny, I think. But here's the other thing, too. Don't underestimate the effort needed to implement a simple idea. The idea itself may be simple, but the implementation may actually be pretty complex. So Bill Perry and I, back in the late 1990s, boy, that seems like a long time ago. It was. It's called Surviving the Top 10 Challenges of Software Testing. And I've been keeping up with those challenges ever since then. And people have commented that the challenges are simple and easy to solve. But the thing that I've noticed over the remaining 30 some odd years since that book is that the same issues are still there. I will go into a group and we'll take a survey and we'll make a list and we will look at the root causes on that list, and the same people problems persist year after year. And I think it's easier to obtain the head knowledge than it is to actually implement those solutions at work. Finally, I encourage you to consider wisdom. Wisdom is king, really, when it comes to what we're doing as testers. Before knowledge comes wisdom. You might think, well, I need knowledge before I get wisdom. Well, in one way that's true, but think about this. You may learn a lot of different kinds of techniques, but your ability to apply those techniques are going to be limited if you don't have the wisdom to know how to use them and then the context to understand them. One of the problems we have in starting out in something is that you don't know what you don't know. I've kind of formed a little new Randyism around that. My wife and I were on vacation last month, and we ran into some road work right at the end of our journey to the place that we were going to stay. And it was about a 20-minute delay. They had traffic completely stopped on this 2-lane highway so that they could do this road work. They'd let one group of cars pass, then another pass. And I just kind of made a remark, because we didn't know we were going to run into this little event out there on the highway, is that you don't know what you don't know. And then I added, until you know it. And that's really true. We don't know what we don't know until we know it. Now, talking about wisdom, I've recently published that book that I was mentioning, The Wit and Wisdom of Software Testing, which is out there on Amazon. If you're curious about some of my little Randyisms and some of the wisdom that you can gain in software testing. And it's wisdom that helps you understand what you need to be going to be a successful tester or test manager. And so the things that we've just gone through, these actually 16 things here, are things that I really wish that I had known when I first started testing. And I hope they serve you well. Once again, if you find this information valuable, I hope you share it. I hope you like it, and I hope you subscribe to the channel, because I usually try to post a new episode every week. And also, I'd like to hear your comments about what have you done in your career to become a better tester, and what are some of the lessons that you wish that you had learned that you would tell a new tester especially. So thanks a lot for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time.